I think the main message is don't just model, don't just consider the numbers. Just make sure you do that and you are aware of what the implications on nature are for your decisions. Don't be blinkered, basically.
In an earlier episode of the podcast, I talked with Dr. Janet Fisher, where we discussed the rise to dominance of the ecosystem services framework and its limitations for resolving problems in landscape decision-making. Around that same time, a group of researchers made up of ecosystem modelers, artists, ecologists, and social scientists were getting together to ask, if the ecosystem service concept has run its course, how might we think of more holistic strategies for deciding how to use or how to treat land? Part of this episode summarizes an academic paper that was produced through these collaborations. In this episode, I speak with the lead author of that paper, Dr. Beth Cole, who is Senior Advisor in Earth Observation at Natural England. Beyond the content of the article, what this episode really offers is a deep look into how the concept of landscapes forces interdisciplinary work. The lessons about processes for negotiating embedded, disciplinary worldviews and ingrained forms of knowledge production are valuable for how to do research in their own right. But these learnings bear striking resemblance to the group's conclusions about how to make more convivial decisions on the land. I'm Adam Kahlo. You're listening to Landscapes. Here's Beth Cole.
So the paper really looks at the ecosystem service concept or framework as a concept and identifies some of the challenges with that as a concept, and comes to the idea that actually for landscape decision making, which is a complex kind of process, we need to enhance that concept, which has been fairly well established now, and add in a set of sort of complementary approaches. We've called them lenses. They're more viewpoints of things that should be considered to go alongside that concept to make sort of more holistic decisions. So we identified the lenses, as we called them, as power and market gain, ecosystem services, so that's the existing one that we're enhancing, cultural landscapes, and ecocentric. And the idea was by bringing in different viewpoints and perspectives, we can make better, more holistic decisions. We've also proposed a framework as a way of kind of trying to align these lenses. We don't give a exact one-size-fits-all answer of the way to do it, but we kind of propose how they might sit alongside each other.
So isn't the ecosystem service framework already attempting to do this in some way? Isn't some of its core argumentation that it is able to provide a more holistic view of values and relationships on the landscape? So why does it need this modification?
It's good at what it does, it's good at what it's good at, but it's not good at everything. It's got some failings, or, well, it's shortcomings, I should say more. We basically say, let it do the stuff it can do well, and think from completely different viewpoints to try and do the extra stuff. Things that it's not so good at are identifying values or cultural perspectives that are things that can't really be identified as services, because the whole sort of framework concept is based around the fact of what nature provides for humans, what the benefits or services to human well-being. There are some things that it just inadequate at valuing. So we're saying, let's not scrap it, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but equally let's try and add to it and really try and incorporate some of the elements of the complex sort of decision making.
One of the key narrative structures in the paper is the discussion of this flower petal diagram, because it does seem that the ecosystem services framework does have a trend in research to try and take on these more complicated and complex and contested valuation processes by doing research on them to understand and translate them into the kind of service language. In the flower petal diagram, the paper talks about how the ecosystem service framework attempts to add more petals add different types of values and relations into the framework. But the paper suggests that at some point that type of logic is flawed, correct?
Yeah, I think we argue that we should stop adding petals and add different viewpoints to sit alongside the concept. Because I think you can keep adding petals forever, but it will start to just get overcomplicated. What the concept is struggling with is not always giving equal weight to some of the harder to achieve and harder to value services.
So the paper writes, we argue that we cannot simply keep adding petals or expanding the ES concept further. We need a more holistic way of approaching landscape decisions, one which includes the valuable insights afforded by the ES concept, but which acknowledges how ES represents a particular worldview that must be supplemented by a suite of other perspectives and approaches. I wonder, in this quote, you kind of get the core argument of the paper, but in one sense, it also seems to embrace a certain epistemology, one more from a social constructionist perspective. I wonder, do you think the more kind of biophysical scientists who are participating in this, it seems like a hard pill to swallow for someone who deals more in empirical research aimed at identifying objective truth?
The biophysical scientists who were involved, who were actually mainly focused on ecosystem service modelling and enhancing that modelling and working out how to combine models in a better way to make the concept more complete, actually really did accept this as a viewpoint, because they were saying that, I think I was actually pleasantly surprised how it wasn't such a hard thing for them to accept, because they're fully aware of the challenges and that you can't quantify everything. And the ecosystem service model is very good at quantifiable factors, but it's not so good at the unquantifiable and the taking into account the subtle differences and the more local based knowledge that you really can't feed into a generic wide viewpoint.
So perhaps there's an important opening there by a reflective attitude amongst people who work with this framework, day in and day out. Otherwise, there's no space for this kind of collaboration.
Yeah, and I think the people who we were working with on this were quite open-minded and quite keen to include some of the other ideas from the other disciplines, because ultimately that is enhancing the whole process for decision making. I think by being open to addressing ideas from different viewpoints, they're ultimately progressing the area, and they know is a very complex, and if they can add tools to that complexity, that's a benefit. But they're not trying to have a one size fits all, I can do everything type attitude.
And I wonder if the umbrella concept of landscapes and landscape decisions helps facilitate that as well. If it was, an environmental sciences project or something looking at biodiversity decline, maybe it's not as open to reflection as something as broad as landscapes.
Landscapes in themselves are a very broad, complicated, interrelational thing. There's so much that comes under that landscapes umbrella, and what people consider landscapes are and what they do and what they provide and what they mean to people is in itself a very wide, broad concept. And I think what this program has really done is to try and take some of the issues that are being developed within disciplines which fall under that, and trying to widen them out and say, and put things against each other and say we can't just keep working within our own disciplines on this topic, because ultimately it is a massive complex topic that interweaves with each other. And I think being part of the network setup that it is tried to achieve, researchers are now working across disciplines on a much wider, broader scale than they would be answering smaller specific questions.
So in your mind, is that the real promise of interdisciplinarity? It's something that appears almost mandatory in a lot of new funding calls. And I think there's a lot of recognition that interdisciplinarity does something good, but quite what it does is unclear, or how to do it is also unclear.
Yeah, I think most people accept that interdisciplinarity is a positive thing. I think ultimately complex problems are never going to be solved by one viewpoint, by one discipline. I mean, in general, in research, big complex problems need to be viewed from multiple angles. And I think the interdisciplinary approach really allows people to think outside the box. I think within the interdisciplinary sort of wider scape, you still do need the focused research in one topic to answer elements of problems. But I think the promise of interdisciplinarity is by linking those up and joining them and being able to answer much bigger, much more complex questions, because you are sort of viewing things from lots of angles, really.
It's almost kind of a parallel to the conclusions of the paper, right? To recognize these multiple approaches but then bring them to the table at the same time. Can you tell me about why these writing groups were formed and what their goal was?
They came directly out of a big workshop, which was a program-wide workshop. So it included all the researchers and principal investigators and everybody involved on the projects under the Landscape Decision programme. And at the end of it, we proposed some writing groups for people to self-select. They were volunteer. You could sign up for them if you wanted to, if you were engaged in them. I went through all of the outputs from the workshop, the notes and the report at the end of the workshop, to sort of pick out some themes of things that have been talked about quite a lot, or that were hot topics, or that were discussed, that people engaged with in the workshops and the discussions afterwards. We had initially a long list, and then we got it down to a short list of questions and themes of things that had come up as outcomes of the workshop. We talked through refining those initial themes into some specific questions or working titles. But we did make sure that we had a range of disciplines in each of them, and that everybody who wanted to be involved could be. And that's how they were formed.
So there's already some interesting process elements here, because you have a larger program with an unusually large group of disciplines, because this is a program that includes, biophysical scientists, social scientists, and then the arts and humanities are actually strongly represented. The deciding of the themes, you were already kind of instrumental here in trying to translate what everyone was talking about into a couple clear buckets.
So to do that, I went through the notes and the recordings of all of the sessions, because it was quite a big workshop. It went over multiple days, and it was picking out things that were talked about more than once, or that got people's attention, or that were talked about from different viewpoints.
But this sounds like a really important step, because if you had come back to the broader group and presented, 4 themes out of a whole 3-day workshop of contentious and pressing issues in the environment and society, and the themes you presented were not well received, then you wouldn't have the buy-in to actually embark on the next step, which is some kind of collaborative project.
So I came up with a long list initially myself, which I think I had about 10 or 12 maybe. And I took that to the rest of the program coordination team, who are like a smaller working group, and we maybe slightly refined the wording of them. I think we kept all 10 in there, but maybe we just slightly shuffled them. And then they were presented to the people who were interested in participating.
And were you comfortable with this prioritization? Did you feel it was kind of an ad hoc democratic process, but at some points there was kind of more directive decision-making being used? At any point, did you think, I wonder if we're kind of silencing some of these voices, or did you think that this was going above and beyond what is usually done in terms of, prioritization of a research agenda?
I think I was happy with it, because it became quite clear in the discussions which the favourites were. There wasn't any, I don't think there was any that just got pushed to one side or cut out because there wasn't a take-up. Often it was more that they were actually maybe a bit overlapping or a bit similar, or had slightly different focuses but were on a same theme. So they were maybe combined, or we discussed which one of the two would work better in reality when written up. So I think it was a quite organic process, just in making sure we were including lots of views. I don't think any topics just got shoved under the carpet.
You have this theme for a paper, which is the role of the ecosystem services framework on landscape decision-making, which you kind of pulled out of a couple of days of interdisciplinary workshopping. And then a number of writers from different disciplines show up, on a Zoom call, essentially. Can you describe how those first meetings go? How did it move from this broad theme into this critique of ecosystem services and the idea of multiple lenses or worldviews, and suggesting that's the way forward into bringing about landscape decision making?
The whole process has taken quite a long time. At the time, I was thinking this is going on forever, this is taking ages. But in reflection, looking back, I don't actually think that's a bad thing, because it allowed a lot of time for discussion. And each meeting wasn't necessarily just about the focus of what's going into which paragraph of the paper. It was more about discussing the concept and the ideas and how to combine these ideas and viewpoints, and actually really spending time to listen and appreciate each other's ideas from the different disciplines. So the first meetings were quite, if I remember back that far, they were quite formal. As the chair, I had to go in quite structured with what I wanted to talk about addressed in that meeting, quite a plan. By the time we were a third of the way through, say, they were much more organic and much more self-leading, and much more people had got to know each other, and people were prepared to talk and chat, and the conversation just sort of led itself slightly more. You then went into the next phase of, we actually do need to write something and get some of this structured and down, and how are we going to turn these interesting thoughts into a paper. And I think the process, it's interesting how the meetings themselves changed as the process was going through the different stages. So the first meetings, I would say, were a bit more formal. People were a bit more shy. It took a while to get to know each other and bring out, confidence to be able to speak. And then once the ball was rolling, the group really did just gel, and it was quite easy to get discussions flowing.
You could write about this topic in so many ways. So what were some of the key, insights or boundaries that were created through either those formal or informal sessions that brought about even a sense of, at least performed consensus, if not, true consensus around what the writers thought was important to contribute in this area?
I don't know if we had any boundaries. I really, actually, looking back, can't think at which moment we came up with the penny dropping to have the lenses. I think we had been talking about different viewpoints for quite a while, and that I think very quickly we came to the idea that we needed to be holistic and consider everyone's views, and we were quite conscious that we needed to bring in all the disciplines. But the idea of formalizing them into what we then have now subsequently called lenses, I think it was literally somebody was talking and somebody else chirped up and said, I think what you're saying is that we need to view this through different lenses. And we all stopped and suddenly went, yes, that's it. That's exactly it. There was not a formal process in that was what was going to happen, and that we were going to try and work out lenses and what fit in our viewpoints into them. It was more that they came out of the discussions that we were having.
So I wonder if this kind of informal, unstructured time is one of the secret ingredients to create this process as you're describing. That seems a really poor match for the majority of how academia is structured, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think you can only be informal for a certain amount of time. There was a point at which we then needed to work out how that was going to make a paper and how that was going to fit on the page and structure it. And that sort of was the next phase, so to speak. So once we had decided that we were going to do this lens approach, and we had kind of talked about what they would be, we then really had to sort of get ourselves into line and start to work out how it would form as a paper. And to do that, we actually spent at least one, if not two, sessions really working out a structure for the paper and what bits would go where, how the story would unfold on the page. So I think, yes, the informality at the beginning was good because it meant that we really got into the depths of the discussions and what came out was good. But I think you can't do that for too long.
You've written a blog that is summarizing some of the lessons learned from this process. And in it, you write, nuances can be ingrained in language. Subtleties in an argument need to be explored and not just lost in translation. It is helpful to have a person in the group who pays attention to the translation aspect, who takes time to listen and interjects if meaning is being lost or confusion sets in. I wonder if you can give an example of this when this happened in the context of the paper. It sounds like this is this kind of key role of taking advantage of the informal even playing field of conversation and translating it into something next.
I think there's no doubt about it that one of the biggest challenges that interdisciplinary working brings with it is a different use of language by different disciplines. Sometimes people can be using language or phrases or terminologies that are quite clear to them, but might be not as clear to somebody from a different discipline. And actually, sometimes we worked out that people were talking from two different viewpoints about an issue and sounded like not argumentative, that's too strong, but it might be disagreement, when actually somebody could chip in and say, but I think you're agreeing. I think you're saying the same thing, but you're just saying it very differently. And actually, just having the dynamics within the group that somebody could listen to the two arguments and actually, I think often that came from an external third party who might not be in one of the two might not be in one of the two camps or the two disciplines, who could say, from an external point of view, I think what you're saying is very aligned. You're just saying it slightly differently, or you might be putting emphasis on a slightly different point. And that sometimes just happened where somebody would just chirp up and just say it, and then the penny would drop and everyone would say, yes, yeah, we get it. Or other times, I think you did just need to be a bit more aware that people might be disagreeing, but using quite conflicting language to do that. And actually then you'd just have to, I think mainly as a chair especially, you'd have to just be aware of that and really be taking the time to listen to everyone's viewpoints and work out what the style of language they were using.
I think probably guilty of this a couple of times in the meeting, but we're so trained in the jargon of our own disciplines. I remember going on some diatribe about epistemological commitments, and one of the senior members in the writing group said, Adam, you can't use that language because we don't know what you're talking about. And yeah. I was like, really? This is actually core to what I do every day. But maybe not only having a translator there, but also kind of being a little bit more humble in trying to understand where our own language is generated and how that can be exclusive.
It's a bit about assumed knowledge, isn't it? Something that's very common everyday usage to you, or that you might think is quite basic because you use it so frequently, you don't know that it is actually, or you've forgotten over time that it is actually a more technical or ingrained or quite a depth of knowledge in the language that you're using, because it's become so familiar to you. So I think, yeah, it's a bit about taking the time to think about your own language, but also developing the relationships in the group. So somebody could say to you, oh, Adam, we don't quite get that. Can you say it again in a different way? And not being nervous, not sitting there thinking, oh, I'm not as clever. I can't do it. I can't understand what he's saying. He's saying something that's above my head. It's probably not. It's just probably that it's a different use of language that you're not used to hearing, and you could probably quite easily grasp the concept if different words were used. So I think building up the relationships within the group so people feel that they can speak out and say, oh, can you just reword that? Can you just say it again? And not feeling like they need to sit there in silence because they don't think they understand.
One of the areas of tension that I noticed, if you want to call it tension in the group, was around the notion of power relations. So the paper tries to suggest that there are other viewpoints that are valid in understanding landscapes and landscape decisions that should help inform these decisions beyond the ecosystem services concept, which is fairly dominant in terms of a lot of research and policymaking circles. But then the question for me, and I noticed a lot of debate about this in the group, is how do you negotiate which of these viewpoints are more powerful and where they derive their power? And then if we do want them to be held equally or more equally, what needs to be changed so that can actually be achieved, instead of just saying, we should listen to these other viewpoints.
So in the latter section of the paper, we talk about how to actually try to align these viewpoints, how to include them. And it is acknowledged that ultimately the people who are making the decisions, even though they can listen to all the viewpoints and all the different lenses and take into account all of the sources of knowledge, which is what we're advocating in the paper, they have to make a decision, and that decision will probably be biased upon which of the lenses their own viewpoint sits closest to. So how to balance that the power between the different viewpoints is tricky, and we've tried to set out a couple of ways to make sure all the viewpoints are on the table. But I think ultimately, no matter how you say it and how you put them together, people are going to feel more aligned to one viewpoint than another. Facilitating being able to weight those viewpoints in an equal way is something that is very, very hard to do.
When I think about it just now, it almost seems as a more fundamental challenge to the ecosystem services framework than I'm thinking about it when we were writing the paper, because one of the whole ideas of the ecosystem service framework is to flatten these power dimensions by bringing people together around a common framework. But then if we're saying that in that effort, it might seem like you have a common framework, but you actually end up silencing a number of viewpoints that are actually really useful into making decisions.
I mean, I think what we tried to do is give a couple of ways to align the lenses and make sure all the information is heard. But I don't think we've hit the nail on the head completely. I think there is still going to be power battles between how much the lenses are taken into account. We just have to try to present ways that minimize that as much as we possibly can at this stage.
So the paper in its current form gives this example of a decision of a local authority being required to allocate land for new homes, but also needing to bear its need to keep other ecosystem values in check, like reducing flooding and increasing carbon capture. Could you describe how these different lenses might view this issue?
If we go through the lenses in turn, without considering them all together, each one on its own would probably come out with quite a different outcome to that decision that needs to be made. So we've to put it in context, we're saying the power and market gain lens would probably look at evidence existing on land ownership structures, the cost of different options and how they might benefit the communities, and the wider financial benefits of in different schemes. And they might favour developing sort of premium high cost housing that might therefore produce more income for the area or for the landowners, and build upon sort of what the greatest gains are for the community, which might end up with probably more higher density housing in that situation. The ecosystem service lens would probably put more of an emphasis on the way which natural land provides benefits to the site, provides the benefits and values to the society. So it would look at the flood management and the carbon sequestration, and might favour some more nature-based solutions. So things like natural flood management, where it will plant trees within the catchment. They'll look at the non-financial benefits as well as just the financial gain, really. So they'll probably think about the wider benefits. So things like air quality, noise, recreation, crop pollination, biodiversity, as well as just the amount of where the maximum financial gain from the housing location position of the new houses will be. But it would recognise that we need the houses, so that we would need to build some, but it might be the positioning of them will be informed by other decisions as well. So they might include green spaces within the housing, or planting trees upstream to prevent some of the flood above the catchment, or for example. The cultural landscape lens would use the housing allocation to sort of repeople the landscape, maybe providing cheaper rural affordable houses in the communities, regenerating the rural economies and connecting the people in the landscape with people that live there to the landscape, and maybe focus on sort of promoting population growth within the existing population, preserving the characteristics and the sort of shared local knowledge of the landscapes. They look at very place-specific solutions, and look into the past or the cultural and the current sort of cultural connections with the landscape. And finally, the ecocentric lens, which is would probably question more about whether the land needs to be reused for housing, for dedicated to human housing, and how much is already used for that purpose. Whether it could be, whether the existing housing could be improved, whether that would be enough, and also whether there's a balance of habitats taking into account the other species in the area. It might focus on looking at the connectivity of the habitats and the heterogeneity of different types of biodiversity at different scales. So each of them would probably have a different focus in the way that they approach the same landscape decision.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about that is you could imagine some kind of decision-making body that is wholly made up of one of these worldviews, and then the result is a drastically different outcome on the landscape.
Yeah, I think where the houses were built, the amount of houses, the type of density, whether the flooding reduction had an equal weight to the housing, or whether it was a secondary thing that was just a tick box exercise, or whether they really did want to achieve that, could be very, very different depending on the people or the group of people making the decision.
And then let's say that using the same example of the hypothetical one that's given in the paper, how do you then bring these lenses together? What would it actually look like in terms of a space where these different forms of knowledge were heard or presented? And then that leads up to some kind of decision about how to build houses and where to build them and what shape they should take.
What we propose is really that, well, the aim is that you're giving equal weight to each lens, that you integrate all the information from each of the lenses. So information could be the information that's provided by each lens could be quite different in its form. It could be quite narrative in one sense, or it could be quite quantitative from another lens, and with the aim to get a convivial consensus. Process of doing that is tricky, and I think we basically say that to do that you need to really ensure that you get the representation of all lenses brought to the table. You talk about multiple solutions and you talk through the impacts of different multiple solutions in a transparent conversation, which can then go through a cyclical cycle. So you can go around it multiple times until agreement is made, or the sort of multiple dimensions of a solution are really taken into account in the decision. You'd need to look at the different scales of information and knowledge that could be brought to the table from the different lenses, the types of knowledge and voices that are heard from the different lenses, because they will provide different types of information, and make sure that then some of the voices aren't overlooked.
So listening to this process, obviously I agree with something like this that could be tried, but one of the key critiques of the ecosystem services framework is the transaction costs of doing all of these types of analyses for all of these decisions. But now we're almost suggesting to add even more transaction costs of some kind of multi-layered, iterative decision-making framework. Isn't this too slow? Or how would you respond to a critique that says we actually need more authoritarian decision-making because of the pressing environmental problems that we face?
I don't think it has to be that much slower. I think all we're saying is don't ignore people's views. Don't ignore sections of views or sections of knowledge. I think it's a fairly simple message, ultimately. And setting up the process to be able to do that might be a bit tricky, but I think the main message is don't just model, don't just consider the numbers. Just make sure you do that and you are aware of what the implications on nature are for your decisions. Don't be blinkered, basically.
I wonder if going through this process, you've written this blog about some thoughts about interdisciplinarity. One of the key papers that I've always gone back to about this is a paper titled, "Is Interdisciplinary Research a Mashup?" And the kind of question they ask there is, if we're looking at a problem, and this problem is landscape decision-making, and we just look at it from one discipline, and then in the same paper kind of look at it from another, have we achieved interdisciplinarity, or do we need to do some creative translation in order to actually come out with a new emergent property of some kind? What do you think about this concept, and do you think that we achieved that, or did we just do the lower hanging fruit of just putting the different disciplines next to each other?
I think the idea of a mashup is that you integrate different ideas and you put them together in a new way. I'd say it's a creative undertaking that produces something in a way that is new. I don't think true good interdisciplinarity doesn't just put two ideas next to each other. There is some kind of translation involved in it to mesh them. What we've done here in this paper, I think you need to consider things from different viewpoints, but I think have tried to integrate them in a way. When we were defining the lenses, we looked at lots of elements from different viewpoints. I don't think we just said you look at it from A, then you go to B, then you go to C, and then you go to D. I think we really, in those definition of those lenses, we really did start to break down, integrate some of the viewpoints from multidisciplines and mesh them together. I would say we've not just gone for the low-hanging fruit of putting different disciplines' views next to each other on the page and saying you need to consider them all. But I think what we haven't done, which I think would be a bad thing, would be to really rip apart each individual viewpoint and say that's not valid on its own, because we're saying they are all valid.
And I guess that's the kind of hopeful aspiration that the paper argues, is that decision makers, those with the hand on the levers to make these big changes in the landscape, would do the same.
I think it is quite an idealistic viewpoint, but I think this is a good place to be fairly idealistic and put those things forward. If you can't do it in a paper where you're proposing a new way of looking at things, then I think it's a good thing to be positive and idealistic in this.
I will say that something very interesting that kind of gives insight into this process, into the actual gears, is that we had these conversations as a whole group, and then there was delegation of tasks. And at some point, I was in charge of writing a certain lens, or at least a few paragraphs in about a lens, for example. You could tell that where I was writing those, in that ownership, I was writing in a little bit more of my home discipline, and reviewing the paper, you could tell where that was coming out from others. That meant that kind of you as the lead author would have to then renegotiate some of the collective agreements after these individual delegations were carried out.
Yeah, so I would say that was part of the editing process. Took quite a while. It was iterative as we went along, and I think we had a system where people were given an allocation of a chunk of writing to take charge of, and when we put them all together, there was a process where other authors from the group could comment or edit or make remarks. They helped clarify points often, helped identify areas where needed more explanation, or also at some points did temper, bring down some of discipline heavy sort of language from particular authors. And I would say it was quite a slow process, because it did take quite a few goings over to make sure that we edited it so it flowed and so it wasn't a very disjointed piece of work with lots of different styles of writing in it, but equally keeping true to some of those voices that initially wrote the sections, because they were allocated based on people's expertise and their knowledge of where they had input into the discussions.
So you gave us all a bone to chew on. I wonder, I did feel like there was a lot of trust in you as the lead author and the convener of these chair groups. How did you build that trust? And what's your research background? How did you come to the point where you embrace interdisciplinary collaboration as opposed to kind of working at the forefront of some kind of disciplinary expertise?
I think the trust, was very kindly granted to me, really, through building up relationships with working with the group for quite a long time. And that goes back to the same point about saying don't try to rush the process. I think an element was that this paper did fall within my field. So I felt I had quite a bit of confidence in being able to edit the text and lead the discussions, because I understood the discussions and I knew from my background that I knew the viewpoints. I hadn't, however, worked and done anything like this sort of leading an interdisciplinary group before. So a bit of it was learning on the job and just being able to apply skills I'd gained throughout, my previous experiences, trying to take time to really consider and think about other disciplines and be aware myself that I needed just to learn how to do that. and have a go. And I think my background, where I have worked in ecosystem service modelling, and I have a remote sensing background, but I've always been very applied and with terrestrial sort of ecosystem service side of that stuff. I did feel that having the subject knowledge allowed me to have some confidence. On some of the other groups, the writing groups, where I felt less ownership of the topic or less confident in the content, I think the editing process is harder and slower, and I've handed over lead authorship on one in particular to somebody else because it's just really not in my comfort zone to be editing at that level.
Was this the same one that there was a little bit more conflict around where the paper was going?
Yeah, it's the group we call Scales, and the actual final working title of the paper hasn't been defined fully at the moment, but that one has ended up being a much more heavily social science driven paper, which is where I don't have the skills, I would say, in lead authoring a social science paper in its own right. It takes into account the views of some of the physical scientists, but the main conflict really has been around very different viewpoints of what scales are, the real fundamentals about how to align social science and arts and humanities viewpoints with the more biophysical or physical scientists on what just really the basics of the notion of what scale is. So the conceptual theory with cultural constructions or social production of scale versus the empirical measurements of distance from sort of mathematical points of view has been a more of a contentious issue in that paper.
That's really fascinating. I feel like you have the ability to write a paper about comparing these two processes, because I feel like I could probably have raised a number of conceptual roadblocks to thinking about ecosystem services and landscape decisions, but presenting those roadblocks wasn't necessarily going to actually reach any consensus. So why bring them up? And maybe that's a failure because then it's leaving out a more deeper, irreconcilable critique.
Yeah, but I think maybe by putting up roadblocks, it maybe makes the discussions slightly richer, should we say, or more really it challenges people's views and makes them think about what their views are to a greater extent, I would say. But it makes the aligning those views and trying to come to some sort of consensus of what the focus and what is going into the paper a much trickier issue. In those discussions, we maybe have had more meetings where we feel like we've gone round and round in circles. I think the circles are moving and they are changing, but you do feel like you're discussing similar points for a longer period of time.
So maybe even more time and more trust building and an informal relationship is required if you want to get to that richer level of a deeper engagement.
Ultimately, there is only a certain amount of time whilst we're all still employed on the projects and have still got funding. And out of the two, that one is not yet in review and this paper is. So I think the two processes have pros and cons both ways.
A boycott of the knowledge production process over the disagreements. You've raised raises a lot of more interesting questions. But in your blog about lessons learned from this process, you highlight 4 elements that you think has made this process work, as it were, in terms of reaching a knowledge output that you feel happy about and is engaging in this field in a productive way. And you talk about language, time, flexibility, and leadership. Do you think you could just give a brief summary of these different dimensions and how they applied into this process?
I think they broadly all come under the sort of title of working in an interdisciplinary way. That was how I was thinking about the blog, because these groups have all been interdisciplinary. So the language one, it's how each subject brings its own language, how we talk about things in different ways, but also the assumed knowledge and the ways of representing things within different disciplines, and how to overcome that in terms of translating between the disciplines and really giving voice to everybody and listening to what everybody's saying. The language one also, it's the discussions, it's the vocal language, but it's also, I think, translates into the written work of different disciplines. What a social science paper looks like compared to a physical modelling paper or a mathematics paper where they talk about equations is very, very different in terms of writing style and the structure and the way the paper looks in the end. The time, I think there's just no getting away from building very good interdisciplinary teams that trust each other and are able to have very good discussions takes time. And I don't think you can underestimate the amount of time it takes to build those relationships. Flexibility and the leadership probably are more focused around the sort of process of getting the paper written, more of the logistics of getting it done. The flexibility relates, I mean, I think in this instance was based around the fact that we had to work around COVID restrictions, and what was going to be in-person writing retreats quickly changed to being long, slower writing online, with lots of Zoom meetings and offline working and coming together to discuss a shared document. But also flexibility in the way that you approach the writing task at different stages through the process and with different people. There's definitely no one size fits all writing process online, I would say. And then the leadership, I think just it does take somebody to coordinate, and I don't think you can write by committee without somebody steering the ship, really. I think the ones that are furthest through the process and that have been submitted or that have been published have had the strongest leadership hand, and I think that is about chivvying people along. It's about making sure the work is done, and also about enabling the discussions and making sure that we're sort of talking about the right thing at some points in the discussions.
One of my mentors always said that universities and academia are really good at producing first chair violinists, but they're terrible at producing conductors of orchestras. And the point there was that we probably need more conductors of orchestras than we need more first chair violinists when it comes in terms of how experts are engaging with problems of the environment. Having gone through this experience, if you were a funding agency, or you could tell a funding agency how to replicate this experience but make it as most productive as possible to bring the benefits of interdisciplinary work to the fore, how would you structure these types of processes?
I really like that analogy with the orchestra and the violinists and the conductors. You do need conductors, but I think you probably need conductors who know about the topic. You couldn't put just a generic project manager in who is just there to facilitate the meetings and make sure people work on time. You need somebody who is engaged in the discussions, who understands the subject area from at least one perspective, or from at least got a base knowledge in the topic from one viewpoint or another. I would say to the funding agencies, don't rush these things. Don't always expect outputs don't fund lots of 6 month short projects. Give a bit more time and waiting to some bigger bits of research, because you can't rush interdisciplinarity. I think I would probably say don't try and make them too big. Don't try and have 20 or 30 co-authors, because it's too hard to listen to that many voices and for that many people to contribute. Fund them well, give people time, and employ people whose role it is to oversee, but who are not so removed from the process themselves.
I think that's a great place to end. Beth Cole, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Landscapes. Thanks for listening. Much thanks to Beth Cole for taking time to do the interview. You can find the links and papers that we mentioned in the show notes. You can find a written transcript of the entire episode at adamcalo.substack.com, where you can also get in touch and learn more about land and food issues. This episode of Landscapes contributes to the UKRI Landscape Decisions Program.